multiculturalism in Australia, although it seems like it's a new term, multiculturalism in Australia existed even before colonization, because we had, like India, indigenous communities in Australia completely diverse. There were over 300 nations on the Australian continent. And in the Indian context as well, it is, I think this idea of tokenization is very much about class and about power and the hierarchies that are put into place because of the workings of power.
Yeah, thank you actually really for making that point so clearly, which also Sowendra and Annie have referred to, which is that when we talk of diversity and pit it against a mainstream and accept that mainstream unproblematically, we are actually automatically setting up a power equation and strengthening what there is. And really, when you look at diversity as the mainstream, everything changes. Yes, it doesn't become a token inclusion of something. Sunny, I know you have a almost visceral reaction to the notion of diversity. Tell us why.
Okay, so I'm just going to put a little bit of context because this is my first time at JLF, and I'm not sure if many of you are familiar with my work. I am a writer. I write both fiction and nonfiction. Filling in a little bit from Urvashi, I am also from a very small town, from UP. The rest of my family is from Bihar. So I'm very much on the periphery in many ways. I grew up all over the place, in India and abroad. So my work tends to cover this strange process. So it's Indian, but it's also other things. Now, I live in the UK right now, and I have, over the years, developed a complete visceral hatred of the word diversity. I refuse to talk about inclusion. I think if we're going to talk about things, we should be talking about equality, we should be talking about justice, and we should be talking about decolonization. I think, sometimes when I'm in India, there's this sense that, we got our independence in 1947, so we're now done. But, thank you. Thank you. And I think this is for me to be here talking about diversity in India is really weird. But I'm taking the chance because I'm looking at it going, I'm Hindu, I'm upper caste, I live in the UK, I have a PhD, I'm about as powerful as you can get. So for me to be on a panel talking about diversity in India is absurd. Truly. But since I'm here, I think we need to also think about how do we get that justice? How do we get that equality? And in my work, in my writing hat, I try and ask a couple of questions. Yes, I know I can tell every story in the world. If I can do it well, that's better. But I always start by asking, is it my story to tell? Should I tell that story? And if I tell that story, am I taking the voice away from somebody who does not have the same power? So therefore, maybe it's my job to say, I'm not going to tell the story, but I'm going to help someone else whose story it is to do it and make a big splash. And that brings me to my second hat, which is in the UK. I started a prize. So it's very strange. I'm at the center of power here in many ways, or power adjacent. And I'm on the margins. I'm a woman of color. I'm a migrant. I'm, not exactly rich in the UK. I'm on the margins. So in the UK, I started a prize. It's called the Jhalak Prize. It's named after my grandmother, who was very anti-colonial. So there's a little bit of an extra joy in having it set up in London. And the prize is for the Book of the Year by a writer of color. Because that means I can raise voices and I can help make a fuss of the voices that are not in the mainstream and that don't have the same kind of power. So that's how my practice as a writer and a human being, hopefully, works around this concept. But I prefer not to use the word diversity.
Let me push you a little bit further on that, actually. You say you prefer not to use the word diversity, and you have a hatred for the word inclusion because they've come to mean certain things to you, tokenistic things also when living in the UK, let's say. And you replace it with the word equality. But actually, any of these terms, and all of them are problematic. None of them is sufficient. They are all necessary. But equality, for example, in a country like India, means almost nothing, because let's say you look at it in terms of gender equality, and people often say feminism is about equality, which has been one of the things about it in the world. But in India, what does it mean? Who does a Dalit woman want to be equal to? Does she want to be equal to a Dalit man? Or does she want to be equal to an upper caste man or an upper caste woman? And none of those things is where she particularly necessarily wants to go. So I'm just questioning you on your attraction for equality.
Well, okay, so I look to mostly American, but also a lot of African. I look at primarily black feminists for my way of thinking about the world. So when I'm in the UK, I don't want to be equal to a white man. I don't want to be equal to a white woman. I want to have access to the same levels of opportunity, the same corridors of power. I want to be able to be dealt with as an equal human being. Now, we're in this place. I mean, I had multiple sort of moments of discombobulation when I was walking here, going, why are we talking about diversity in a moment where this country is in the process of trying to disenfranchise an enormous number of its citizens? It's bizarre to me. So, no, I don't think it's a question of a Dalit woman wanting to be an upper caste woman, but it is about saying, can she have access to those things? Can she have access to the same level of education, the same kind of opportunities for education? I'll give you an example. With a non-white name, a non-Western, non-English name, or let's say British name, people have to send out between 2 to 3 times the number of job applications in the UK with the exact same qualifications to get an interview as somebody who has a British name. That's the starting point of it. There's a good chance the figures are worse in India, which means that if you have a certain name, mine is Singh, it opens a lot of doors. Those doors stay shut to people without that. To me, that is equality. When that door opens with the same ease, the same level of smoothness for all of us. And that, yes, that means fighting hard. I always say decolonize everything, every last thing. But that's what we need to do.
Yeah, I would add to what you're saying, maybe opportunity, which you said, and also dignity.
Yes.
But let me turn to you, Roanna. In some ways, you are, within quotes, similarly placed in the sense that you are also located in a diaspora outside, where by virtue of being who you are, you become the minority. Whereas here in India, you occupy a different space. Yeah. How does that really impact your writing work? And how do you see yourself in that situation?
I think for me, it's opened up a lot of potential for subversion, literary subversion on the page. I just want to say that as someone who is from, say, from an Indian background in Australia, yes, I am on the periphery, but I also am aware of my privileges. As a highly educated, English-speaking, culturally Catholic, I am very critical of the power abuses in the Catholic Church. But culturally, I am, that's how I grew up. And so having access to that Western kind of Christian tradition, I have huge privileges in Australia, while at the same time being constrained as a woman and as a brown woman who speaks like this, but is constantly saying, this is also an Australian accent now, by virtue of me being an Australian citizen. And I'm very proudly Indian, but I'm also Australian. I can be both. But in terms of how that affects the work, thank you for bringing it back to the work. To me, it opens up the potential for looking at the nuances of our communities, multiple communities in Australia of Indian background. So our Indian communities in Australia are kind of like a replica of all the class, caste, religious, linguistic complexities that we have in India. We have the same things but on a smaller scale within Indian communities in Australia. So you have multiple Malayalam associations, Hindi associations, not just one but many, and they're often, in conflict with each other, etc. So, but in my work, I try and use the arsenal of satire and of comedy to talk with a light touch about serious things. And from my position on the periphery in India and in Australia, I can see the so-called center. The center is always shifting, but the so-called center of power with the eyes of someone who is not directly benefiting from that center, so I can laugh at it. Mm-hmm. And so I try and kind of do that. I try and laugh at the center, but I also laugh at us, our communities, on the page in my work.
Actually, that's something, thank you for ending on that. I want to ask you a little more about that, because you're very unsparing towards your own community, very unsparing in your criticism, in your satire, and in your stories. It's very sharp, that. In a sense, Sowendra got into a lot of trouble being self-critical of his own community, and I'm going to ask you to talk about that in a minute. So for you, what's the reaction to that from the South Asian community in Australia?
Yeah. It's a very curious thing, because a lot of my immediate friends and family don't read literature. But so for them, it's a moment of pride to have, our Indian communities represented on the page, which is not done as often as it should be. Of course, there's a long line of Indian-Australian writing in Australia, and I'm just one part of a long continuum. It is, I think people felt proud and happy to, they read the blurbs and the reviews. I don't know how many read the book itself, although I did get a lot of compliments about, finally we can see people like us on the page. So yes, thank you for picking that up. The thing is, fiction is a lie. We all start out as readers understanding that, yes, this is a lie. And so as writers, within that framework, we have the responsibility to be as truthful as we can within that framework of the fictional lie. So yeah, that's what I try to do in terms of being as unsparing. I love that word.
As
on
a
the page.
Truthful lie.
Yeah.
Sowendra, let me come to you. So in some way, every piece of writing about you starts off by saying he's a Santhal writer. Yeah. A tribal who lives in Jharkhand, who has not kind of moved to Delhi, even though you might have moved from Kachela to other places, but not out in Delhi. So in some ways, you are the authentic tribal located still in what is largely a tribal area. But from where are you actually writing? And if you could address a little bit the point that Sunny raised, where she said part of being aware of diversity, or whatever it is that you call it, is to also not take the privilege of writing somebody else, but to perhaps assist them. But because with you and possibly Ruby Hembrom, who set up Adivan, the tribal publishing house, there aren't that many voices coming out of tribal communities. And so one thing is you writing yourself from that, within quotes, authentic place. The other is, would you say that if mainstream, again, all these words are in quotes, mainstream writers were to choose to write about tribal areas, that they should not be doing that?
Urvashi, there are, I think, 3 parts to your
Many questions. You can choose to answer whatever you want.
The first one is about where I come from and which stories I write and from where I write. The second part is the diversity or this inclusiveness in my own writings. And the third part is about who can tell the story better. I think I will tackle the second part first. Okay. Okay, I have been labeled as an Adivasi writer. Okay, that is my description everywhere. So with that label, it implies that I am already marginalized. Okay, I am a disadvantaged group, and now I am being asked that issue of diversity in my writing. So is it a legit question that a person who is already on the margins be asked to be inclusive? I mean, shouldn't this be the responsibility of those who already have the power, who can bring others into their fold? There might not be diversity or inclusiveness in my works. Why? Because I am telling the story of my people. The things that I have seen. I have a bit of issue with saying that I'm telling the story of my people, because that means that I'm representing them, which I'm not doing at all. I'm just
you've
saying,
already said, you've clarified.
I am just writing what I have seen, what I have learned, and what I'm hearing. I'm collecting stories. Okay, so my stories might not have that diversity. Why? Because the stories which I'm telling, that maybe it hasn't been told earlier, maybe it hasn't been told in a better way, because those who could, they did not. That's it.
No, but I think, the point that Roanna made, which was that if we look at diversity as the marginalized thing, then we see a certain kind of picture. But if we see diversity as the mainstream, there is no reason why that diversity should not be diverse within itself as well, which I think is what your writing is doing. So it's not that you're being given the responsibility of being diverse. And it's not that your writing represents only one kind of reality. No, it is actually, it contains whole worlds within it. So maybe you could...
I'm just trying to frame this in a polite way.
You don't have to be polite.
Actually, here also I think this power structure comes. Those who have power, they have been telling us stories from beforehand. So, so those who have had power of telling stories, they have been telling us stories. So, and it has taken us this much long time to actually come forward and tell our stories. I am not that powerful yet. Maybe when I have that power, I will think what I will do with that power. That's all I can say.
You want to say something?
Oh, just from what Sowendra was saying, just this idea about the linking of literary excellence is always linked to the mainstream. In Australia,
exactly.
Literary excellence is linked to whiteness, and I'm sure in the UK as well. So it's about changing that story of literary. So you can be an Adivasi writer, except that now, when you say you're an Adivasi writer, or they say, I'm a multicultural writer, you're an immigrant writer, Annie, I don't know what labels have been thrust upon you, but woman writer, it's because these are all marginalized identity categories that are seen as, tokenistic, they're telling their own stories, and it's kind of like,
put them aside.
Migrant porn, or, indigenous Adivasi porn, or female, that sort of thing, telling the story of the community. But if you change that idea of an Adivasi, labeling yourself as an Adivasi writer does not necessarily mean that you're marginalizing yourself. It is also about it's also about literary excellence.
Roanna, wait just a moment.
Okay, you
Maybe
don't
we
agree.
should all, can we call a writer an upper caste male urban writer?
No.
Then why an Adivasi writer?
Yeah, sure. Fine, not an Adivasi, but for me as someone who's been labeled as a multicultural writer, I actually feel that instead of resisting that, I actually embrace it, because my multiculturalness is everything about who I am, and it doesn't mean that I'm just someone who is on the, who cannot achieve literary excellence. And you know what I mean? Sorry, I shouldn't have brought the Adivasi nature of your work. Well, your book is called The Adivasi Will Not Dance. That's the title of it. But,
you want to respond to that before I go to Annie?
I guess I'm just trying to make the point of literary excellence not just being tied to the mainstream, but being opened up to encompass other identity categories as well, not just the people in power.
I just hope that maybe in a few years, or maybe in a few decades, or maybe in a few centuries, this label will go away.
Yeah.
And we will ultimately be seen as one.
Few years, not few centuries.
I'm going to step in here.
Can
if
I?
you don't mind.
Is it something immediate?
Yeah,
All right.
immediately.
You know, this is the thing that every panel wants, which panelists should talk to each other, and they never do. But now they're doing it. It's great.
I completely agree with what you've said, because there's something really important. Now, when in the UK, I say, well, white male writer, people get offended. Or I say, well, you're speaking from a position as a white man or a white woman. They find that offensive because it challenges their privilege, their sense of self. It makes them uncomfortable.
It shows them a mirror.
Yeah. And this is why I started by saying I am a Hindu upper caste woman, because we need to interrogate our privilege and say this is who we are. This has nothing to do, what I write has nothing to do with literary excellence. It has to do with my ability to see a world that has been structured socially, historically, culturally, and economically. And I think I agree. I think the equality would be when we interrogate, if they're going to say a writer of color, in my case, or a multicultural writer, or an Adivasi writer, we should also label everyone else.
Yeah, totally.
I think that would be one way of saying, sorry, this is the playing field.
Okay, I'm going to now bring down the baton. Annie. Annie, I want to ask you to speak, of course, to the issue that we're all talking about, but in the context, particularly of your most recent work, Prelude to a Riot, which I found completely fascinating, because to me what it's doing is, without any chest thumping or anything like that, it's telling you the little stories of people and the ways in which tensions over almost nothing accumulate and contain within them the seed of terrible violence. And in many ways, even though you did not know when you were writing it that you would be on this panel talking about diversity, but in many ways, the threat that's looming over that community all the time is the loss of that very diversity which so enriches their interactions. Could you talk a little to that?
So I think that one of the things that Roanna said I found very interesting, and which is true, is that diversity is really the norm, especially in a multicultural, traditionally, millennia-old multiculturalism in this country. And I mean multiculturalism in the truest sense, where everybody inhabited their own culture, lived next door to multiple other cultures, and gave and took from each other's cultures. I think that when I started to research, I didn't set out to write a novel. I set out to research something else, which was labor rights in a particular place of the country. I went looking for wage labor and that kind of story, and I thought I would write a journalistic article. What I found was that this was a very peaceful, on the surface, multicultural, inclusive, quote-unquote inclusive kind of, what we now call inclusive, but just the sort of place that just was, and is. It just is like this, that here's a Hindu, here's a Muslim, here's a southern person, here's a northern person, here's a migrant laborer, here's somebody else, and that's how it always was. And here are the tribals, and, that's the kind of place that it always was. Now, in that, somebody plants this little seed of outsider. Now, this outsider is very tricky, because in my novel, that outsider is a migrant laborer. But within it, there's also this thing of who is the true outsider. So if you see, at one point, one of the characters is like, these tribals, they're not really from here. And this is, I am quoting verbatim the sort of thing I'm here. The default definition of an Adivasi or an indigenous tribe is indigenous. They were there before you, right? In political terms, that's what you're saying. But I hear people, and I'm quoting verbatim here, people who are saying that they're not from here. we are from here. We are more Adivasi than they are. They come from that corner of the forest. If they cross the forest back and forth, how are they from here? So this little contest about who is from where, and this was something that I found very strange. I mean, like, okay, so a nomadic tribe therefore has zero rights according to you because they're not from anywhere. But that is the mentality, that actually that is how we treat nomadic tribes, that they have zero rights whatsoever, which is why, I mean, you see that pattern with the Roma in Europe and everywhere else. And then that outsider becomes very problematic, because outsider from how much? How much of an outside are you an outsider of? Are you from outside just this valley? Are you from outside the state? Are you from outside the forest area? Are you from outside the country? Are you crossing borders? And then people weaponize this status of you not having lived in the same place for generations or not owning property. They weaponize that to indicate that you are from an outside, your outsider status is outsider enough for you to lose all rights and violence to be inflicted upon you. And I see that building, that conversation building in small ways. I mean, like somebody who is, say, Bengali, somebody who is, say, Bengali Muslim, very easy to say Bangladeshi, and that is happening across the country today. So that is the kind of thing that I was noticing, and which messed with my head to the point that I had to stop writing the journalism and just step away from it and say that, oh, what is going on here, and where is this leading? So, yeah.
I just wanted to say something about Annie's book, which I've read, and I think it's a stunning piece of fiction which is written with the lightness of touch about really complex issues. And that idea of the connection to land and how contested that is and how that can be used to determine who is an outsider and who is not, I think was very beautifully done. And in terms of broadening that idea of diversity to include a focus on complexity and nuance, focusing on that in the work, I think that really stood out to me in Annie's book, Prelude to a Riot. And I thought that was a really beautiful way of using the craft to talk, as Orhan Pamuk says, to talk about important things as if they were unimportant and unimportant things as if they were very important. It changes the focus of the book a little bit, but it makes the themes that you were trying to talk about, a celebration of inclusion and diversity. I know you don't like those terms, but the very even more stark and powerful, I thought. Just the way you formally handled those themes on the page. So
thank you. I'd just like to add to this that the question of diversity, I think, partly is that diversity is lost. I think one of the things that is starting to happen in our country, I can only speak from this context because I know it, what we're suffering from is a loss of diversity. And I mean that in cultural and political ways. Partly this is happening through the scrubbing out of the quashing of the differences where they exist. And partly it's also from this general sense that any difference is problematic. Yeah. And why the novel is called Prelude to a Riot, partly because there is no riot in the novel. The riot actually doesn't happen.
You've got to write the sequel.
So hopefully there is no sequel. But the thing is that this is the thing, that when we speak about diversity, I think when we speak about inclusion, exclusion, all those things, we're really talking about difference of race, difference of ethnicity, difference of language, difference of even of citizenship status, of residency status, of property, of all of that. And this difference makes up diversity. And diversity is a positive thing, right? And we accept that in a vague way, multiculturalism, diversity. Difference we get frightened by. And we try and either flatten it out or go into these little boxes that I'm in my box, you're in your box, and if you must be in your box, then I don't want to come in your box. And I think that is starting to be a problem.
We don't have a lot of time left, so I want to ask each of you to address one other broad question before we open it up. And that question has to do with, Sunny, you said, and I think in your opening statement, why are we even talking about diversity when what is happening in this country, in light of what's happening in this country right now? And Annie, you referred to that as well. To my mind, what lies at the heart of all your works is one notion of home, or a kind of longing for what is home, and the other, the idea of migration, which is, after all, what carries diversity and from one place to the other. How important is it, do you think, in this day and age, in light of exactly what is happening, when a homogeneous identity is being imposed on us, and even a population of 200 million Muslims in this country is seen to be population of outsiders? Where did they come from? How did they take up our space? How important is it to talk of these issues, to talk of migration, to talk of the many meanings of home, to talk of this thing called diversity? Hansda, do you want to? And you speak so movingly of home in an essay about your mother and the home in which you grew up, and how you know that it will not be the same when you return.
I think it is important. I think this is a discussion which I was having with Annie yesterday and today with Rakshanda Jalil. And I don't know how to further go ahead with this one, but talking is important, fighting is more important. At least, contributing in some way. It might be in words, it might be in action, it might be in writing. And start in a sweet way. Keep on struggling. This is what we were talking yesterday, right?
So what did you say yesterday that you're not saying now?
That's all.
That's all?
Yeah.
Okay.
But I hope, I don't know whether hoping is the right word or not, but I hope things will change. I hope all of us understand.
Okay. Sunny, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, so I write a lot about travel. I'm not very fond of the word migration, because it feels kind of final, that you want migrate, and then, I know migratory birds get to go back and forth. I would like to think of the same way with humans, but unfortunately, when we talk of human migration, it's sort of, we just move and we go somewhere and we stay there. So,
I don't think that's the case in India. People are going back and forth all the time.
So I like to talk about just travel and movement. One of the good things about growing up with a father in the Indian Army is that I really don't have a home as such. The closest thing I have for home is where my parents live. And they keep moving. Or they did in my lifetime. Now they've got a home, they've stayed there for a bit. And they're still, again, planning to move. So I don't really write about home. But what I think is important is we constantly, as you said, we write, we resist in every which way. Writing is an act of faith. It's very hard to be pessimist. It's very hard to get depressed for a long time and give up on the world and our humans if you're a writer or any kind of an artist. Because by the act itself, you're asserting a faith that somewhere out there, across time and place, somebody will read you. That's an incredible amount of belief in the humans. So that's where I come from. I think, for me, writing is an act of resistance, but everything else I do. So I started this prize, that's an act of resistance. That's my fight. I'm part of a project which is training up 30 young illustrators of color, and that will continue. It's a 2-year project, and we will continue to do that. So we're building, let's say, an army. Nobody needs writers as solitary heroes, to quote Toni Morrison. We need a pugnacious, militant movement that works together. So it's been really delightful to be here and meet lots of writers and readers who are doing exactly that. It's a movement. So that gives me hope, and I hope we continue on that.
I just want to say that in your comment about the pugnacious militant movement, I just want to say, as an outsider with a lot of privilege and also an insider, an Indian Australian, I salute all of you who are protesting, putting yourselves on the street, putting yourselves at risk, protesting against the very divisive policies of the current government. And I salute every Indian who's come out to support Indians in the mainstream, Brahmanical kind of, the Brahmanical Hindu patriarchy as well. For all their sins, a lot of Hindus have come out as allies in support of people who are fighting for home, to respond to your question. So I can sit here and pontificate about home and belonging and then go back to a very comfortable life, although it's not as comfortable as I would like it to be. But it's just so moving and so humbling and just awesome to see people from my country standing up then, putting themselves at risk. I went to Shaheen Bagh and it was with friends, and it was just an electrifying, very moving space. And I salute the courage of ordinary Indians with everything to lose, putting themselves up, speaking up for home, for a sense of belonging, fighting for that right to belong.
This thing about home is a very tricky thing for me. It's also the theme of my next book, which I'm working on right now. I've always thought about it, and I've always felt a little bit rootless, but I've also come to the conclusion, I've come to multiple conclusions that home is many things, it's not one thing. One of the things that I feel very at home in is literature, actually. I've realized that I feel most at home in literature, not necessarily in one kind of literature, in any kind of literature, in the world's literatures. I feel very at home. I feel very at home in reading and writing, and I feel very at home in multiple places, but particularly I think home is a place within. It's a place where you want to go back and where you feel like both where you can retreat as well as a place where you feel you can be found. And it's a complex place for all those different reasons, but if the home within is assaulted, then where you are geographically hardly matters. I think if the assault is on how you feel, then you can easily be plucked from one place and put into another. It wouldn't matter how you feel about a particular piece of land.
Thank you. That's actually very poetically put. Does anyone want to add anything before I open it up to the audience for any questions? Okay. I just want to, I'm going to open it up. I want to tell you a little story because we're talking about the, Hansda everyone referred to the protests. And this is a story about music and literature and poetry and how it travels. So recently I was in Kerala and just driving through a market on the street, I found a little protest taking place. It was clearly a Muslim area because you could see from the shops and things. And the protest had a little stage and an audience where hundreds of people were sitting. On the stage were young women who were singing songs to protest the CAA and who were shouting slogans, and they had internalized Zaidi, and they had taken it from the women's movement and Kashmir and elsewhere and brought it into this. And when they finished their performance and got off, a group of young boys went on stage. And the feminist in me thought, okay, I don't want to listen to the guys, I'm going. But then I stayed, and the young men got on to perform protest songs in rap, in Malayalam, which they called wonderfully halal rap. And I thought there could not be more variety in this whole thing. So over to you, if any of you have any questions. Let's see. Yeah. You know what we're going to do is is it okay with you if we take 2 or 3 questions and then you respond? Please. And keep them short.
Yes. Thanks very much. What a fantastic panel. I have a question, which is, throughout the panel we've been talking about migration, duality, inside, outsider. I just wanted to say that a lot of us inhabit more than one space at home, we're locals, we belong. Outside, when we migrate, we're outsiders. And with that comes different frameworks of identity. And I wanted to talk about the word decolonization and what that means, because in the West, when you talk about decolonization, you're talking about sort of claiming identity. Whereas in India right now, the language of claiming identity is being used as right-wing rhetoric in many ways about reclaiming your, who you are and purity and all of this. I wonder if you could comment on that a little bit about what's happening in India and how we use the word decolonization.
Thank you. Was there someone behind you? Yeah. No, and I think here, next to you. Mm-hmm.
Okay, my question's for Hansda. So I run a publication called Plates, and I was really taken by how you're saying people would write about your stories, and so I'm very careful about writing stories in rural areas. So I'm from Malaysia, and I cover a lot of indigenous stories because we have many, many other communities in Malaysia that are not represented in our literature and in our schools' histories. Like, we just don't know anything about it. And eventually, I would like to have them as correspondents to write from their part. But I was wondering, have you come across other writings about other communities that you thought that perhaps they should have had a guideline to abide by and be a bit more morally sensitive instead of a bit of voyeurism happening when it comes to writing about marginalized communities? And if you would like to add a list of that, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Urvashi, I have a question for you.
Where?
Yeah, just here.
Oh, yeah, for me?
Right, yeah, for you.
But I'm the moderator.
Yeah, I know, but it basically just like... It basically takes on from what Annie says and what Sowendra says, which is as much as we'd like to talk not about like margins and talk about inclusion, here we are and the gatekeepers of power are still absent, right? I mean, like Sowendra said, as writers, they still struggle to have their voice heard, right? It's not for the want of like not having the platform. It is that the gatekeepers of those platforms are absent. So what can we do to change that? As much as I hate tokenism, there needs to be a certain allowance from those gatekeepers to have these voices heard.
Okay, thank you. And somebody in that, over there at the back? The light is terrible, you can't see anything.
So I have a similar question to, I think, the first question that was raised. I was brought up in Asia, but the first time I heard the word decolonize was in the UK. And I think that's because of the presence of white people in the UK and the way they control systems and institutions over there. I don't hear the word used enough in Asia. In a country like India, I don't know how often it's used, but I don't think it's used very much at all. Why do you think that is, and do you think it's important that we start that conversation?
Thank you. Okay, so who would like to?
Because I have this habit of forgetting things. So before I forget these two questions, I want to answer. Before I actually answer this question, there are two people I know, my friends, who I want to name here. First is Urvashi has named already, Ruby Hembram. She is based in Kolkata. She is the founder of this independent publishing house, Adivani, which aims to publish works about and by Adivasis. And in English, so that it goes out to a wider audience. And the second friend I am going to name is Yogesh Maitreya. His actual name is Yogesh Vanjari. He comes from the Mahar caste. Ruby, by the way, is Santhal, just like me. Yogesh comes from the Mahar caste, who are considered untouchables. And he's a PhD student at the TISS Bombay. And he's the founder of this publishing house, another independent publishing house known as Panthers for Publication, which he calls he aims to publish works about Dalits, by Dalits, but he does not want to call it a Dalit publication house, but an anti-caste publishing house. And I think I think this is where my answer to this question lies about people who are in position of disadvantage, and they have not yet told their stories yet. What those, in that hierarchy above them can do is not tell their stories, but support them in telling their stories. Don't be their voice, be their ally. If they don't know how to write, teach them how to write. If they don't know how to read, teach them how to read. Do not even give a sample of their lives, because then it will be like the first work from that community, about that community, and that will become some kind of a guideline. That guideline should not be there. The guideline should be their own. That is, I think.
Thank you.
Okay, so yes, I think there's not enough conversation about decolonization in India. Now, I am an academic, so I do use that language, and I've used that for a long time. Decolonizing and decolonization doesn't just stop at the UK. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we were talking about post-colonial societies. And I always found it really fascinating that when we talked about post-colonial societies, we talked about the former colonies. We never talked about the colonizers, because they're post-colonial too. Now, decolonization, therefore, doesn't just happen in the colonies or in the UK as the former colonizer. All of us must be part of it. I use a lot of work around whiteness that has been ongoing in the US and UK, mostly by, especially by black writers and black scholars. For me, one of the points of decolonizing fully in India is the abolition of caste. I would like to think, as I said, I use Barner Hesse, who writes on whiteness and white supremacy. He has a scale, and most of us with privileges, caste privilege is very similar to race privilege, are quite nice. We like to be critical, we like to make ourselves feel better. But actually, real act of allyship requires discomfort, and it means we should be discomforted because we need to stop taking up the power in the space. Now, that also means I am not there yet. The final category, the two categories that he sets up, is race traitor, whiteness traitor, and race abolitionist. Now, I use that for myself as a guideline, and I say, I like to think, I'm hoping that I have reached the status of a caste traitor. I would like to be a caste abolitionist. That, to me, is the kind of conversation we should be having about decolonization in this country. And so I don't think it's a foreign term. It's a term that was created by formerly colonized people. It's a term that's come to us from the margins, from people who are on the receiving end of oppression. And I think there's nothing wrong with us having that conversation here. It's necessary.
I don't feel qualified to talk about the use of the term decolonization in India. I don't live in India anymore. But just thinking about what decolonization would look like in India, to me it would mean maybe a Santal Prime Minister and a Mahar President, maybe, I don't know.
Maybe? One Mahar created our constitution.
Yes, yes, exactly.
So maybe we are just going on the right path. Maybe we should just understand.
Can I just step in for it? There's a story.
2 minutes and 17 seconds.
So there's a story of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who is a Supreme Court Justice in the US, and she was asked how many women were enough to be on the Supreme Court. And she said all of them. And so I don't think it's got to be one president and one prime minister. It would be good to see it for the next 200 years, maybe 2,000 years.
I would just like to say this. I'm not an academic, and I think the term decolonization is most often used in academic context, in general conversation, outside. It's not a lay people's word, definitely not in India. In India, even in universities and colleges, the word is hardly ever used. And if it is used often in problematic ways, which I find problematic. It is used to mean to reject everything that is seen as foreign. It's often weaponized to mean that if you are, for instance, if you have a certain set of political beliefs, or if you identify as liberal, or if you just sometimes even in a very just your everyday culture, your lived reality is dismissed, or often you are humiliated using the thing of colonization, that because you were colonized you are unable to think beyond this, or because you were once colonized, or because these are all foreign and British ideas. It's most often used against women, but it's often used against anybody that doesn't fit into that doesn't enable existing power structures. So I think that is one part of the problem. The other part of the problem is that we never look within in our own history to see what the equivalent of imperialism was. There isn't just one colonization. There were multiple, even in ancient history. So what's the narrative that's being built now is that every war in which the victor was, say, Muslim, regardless of where the victor actually came from, whether he was born here, whether he was born somewhere else, whether he came from generations of being within the Indian subcontinent, is being portrayed as an invader and a colonizer, which was not the case. We have a very poor understanding of colonialism here, and we do not investigate imperialism and imperialistic tendencies. And until we start doing that, the word decolonization really is meaningless here.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we have to stop because we are clean out of time. I can't really respond to that question in any detail except to say that Sowendra actually, when he spoke of Adivani and the other press, gave you the answer, which is that we have to battle by opening up our own gates all the time. Thank you all very much for listening. Thank you, everybody on it.
Wow, that was an amazing panel. Thank you so much. Thank you to Sunny Singh, Roanna Gonsalves, Hansda Sowendra Shekhar, Annie Zaidi, and Urvashi Butalia. And thank you very much to the New Indian Express for sponsoring that session. Just a reminder, there's some wonderful music tonight at Hotel Clark's Amer. We have Gavin James, who's a Spotify superstar, and Lisa Marie Simmons, who does amazing spoken word jazz. I've seen her before. She's amazing. So if you can, tickets are still available at the fountain, and